Franklin on 102.9 FM. And anywhere, anytime at WFPR.FM. It's so nice to have you with us today.
Welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring all things wine with you. We are your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lenzi, and you can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the wonderful world of wine. I'm your host, Kim Simone, here with my co-host, Mark Lenzi. How are you this week, Mark?
Everything is great, Kim. How are you?
Good. I'm doing well.
It's a busy time of year, right?
Yeah. It's getting a little chilly out there, and, still here talking about wine because there's always something to talk about, isn't there?
Yeah. The best time of year for wine, too.
You think?
Holidays and yeah. Wine kicks in for sure.
Yeah, I think any time of year is good. Is the best
That's
time
true.
for
That's
wine.
true. But more time with family and friends,
Yeah.
which we've missed a few years of that. So
We have. So this might be the sort of more the social time for wine for many of us because we can pick and choose the wines we're going to use with some of those special holiday meals and maybe discuss them a little bit around the table. But before we get to holidays, we wanted to talk about a couple of articles that we ran across recently about
meeting Pearl Harbor Day, may they rest in peace, to order. Need my glasses and my agenda. Do we have any public comment either from, as Tom Mercer says, the Zoom world or the room world? As usual, seeing none. Approval of the minutes for November 29th. Assume everybody's read them. I have a motion to approve them. Second? Second. All in favor? Yeah, you need a roll call.
George?
Yes.
Natalie?
Yes.
Stephanie?
Yes.
Tyrell?
Yes.
Chana?
Yes.
Michael?
Yes.
And Nicole is yes.
Okay. Operating budget adjustments, town administrator's memo, Mr. Allen?
Finance committee schedule? Did I?
Never mind. I was reading from the minutes of the previous meeting. This 2023 Finance Committee schedule. Does anybody have any objections or changes? Or you're not going to be here?
Not as of yet. We have squished the budget hearings into 3 days in the past, right? So is that a TBD, depending on how well it goes?
I would ask is that what your intention would be, Jamie?
That's correct, just to at least have holds. I think, we've evolved from one night, which was ruthless, and to 4, which was decent. And I think last year we did it at 3, if I remember. I think you're right, Natalie. I think it'd be pretty tough to get under 3, but I think that those are just on there so folks have a hold, depending on how all the dates go and stuff like that, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments?
The only thing I would really mention, if I could, Mr. Chairman, is April 5th is Passover. The council moved that. Originally, we had April 26th as the Finance Committee date because school vacation is also that month. So I just wanted to note that April 5th is Passover in case the committee wants to pass over on that date to observe that holiday. We know that, anybody watched the council meeting last week, maybe not. There's certainly a debate about whether to observe every religious holiday, which ones, what not. It's a tough call. We know school districts do that, but there's a different reason why. So I just want to acknowledge it in case the committee felt like they just want to punt in April and not have to meet, or Oftentimes, it's been very inconvenient for people that are away on that week of school vacation, but that's also a week, the committee could meet two in April as well, which I think would be April 19th. So the council meetings are the 12th and the 26th, so it's up to you guys.
You just want to avoid the issue and go to the 19th?
Which is the
Why
school
don't we
vacation
do
week.
that? Then
Which is
we
a
don't
school
have the
vacation
issue
week.
and-
Yep. So just, you don't have to make a motion to amend it, you could just say as amended to the 19th. We don't want to do too many roll call votes.
Huh? Okay. All right.
But all the other dates should be good.
Yes. You saying we don't need a vote on that, sir?
You don't need to, just as long as everybody's comfortable with it, yeah.
Item B, stabilization funds. For which there is no.
It's after the bond rating report.
Oh, that's right, too, I'm sorry. The bond ratings, Jamie?
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, we put in the packet the most recent bond ratings report, which just came out last week. So we thought we'd just highlight for everybody. Great news, we maintained our AAA bond rating, so good news there. And it seems that the AAA bond rating is something that I believe this community has going to have to really make sure we continue to prioritize. We went up for the sale this week for the borrowing for Schmitz Farm, and we got a 3.444% rate. So that's very good. I think it shows a little bit of signs that maybe the interest rate issue is at least calmed down from increasing. But I think clearly if the bond rating was not at AAA and we were still at AA, that interest rate would be substantially higher. And so that's a very good rate. So I just wanted to offer that and make sure the committee was aware. It's online. And moving forward, as part of our financial policies, as well as saving money, the old-fashioned way, a piggy bank, we'll still maintain, I think, strong commitments in our capital and operating budget to making sure that our stabilization accounts are solid. We've done a great job increasing them, and it's cited right in here is clearly one of the main reasons for the continued stability of the AAA bond rating. So happy to answer any questions on that.
I have a question. How often is that assessed?
Only when we go out to borrow. S&P requires it, so we probably didn't need to do this because there was no factor as to why would we be downgraded. But when you go on a sale in this market, S&P and Moody's and everybody are going to ask for it anyways.
Got it, okay.
Would we have done it if the borrowing was smaller?
Tough to say, but we had 7 bidders, so it worked out.
Does a AAA bring you 7 bidders versus when you were AA, you get 3?
No, it's
No?
more really the market just in general.
And who can invest?
There's a lot of activity out there. I think there's going to continue to be a lot of, while things are good in Massachusetts, overall, I think we still see ups and downs of volatility here or there. I don't think it's necessarily in a bad way, but, I think because there's such an active market financially and globally with so many issues that are injected into it, not just war, petroleum or whatnot, you're going to continue to get an active market. And obviously investors are looking for drops in the market so they can jump in, and that's really what's been happening. And so I think that that's something that's probably going to continue on for a while.
Do we get ratings from other agencies besides S&P or just S&P?
Traditionally just S&P. Yeah.
It's interesting, I think when we borrowed for the fire trucks
Yep.
a year and a half ago, it was 144, I think.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was probably 2.5 years ago now, but yeah, it was 144. So again, the AAA couldn't have come at the better time, and just good management.
Okay, any more questions? The stabilization fund update.
Yep. So there, Mr. Chairman, we just have a list here. Carrie put together a chart from 21, 22, and 23. It's all in the packet. We're trying to put these in as a regular feature of some updates just to show everybody how things are going. You know, lo and behold, we're doing pretty well. I'm happy to answer any questions on it. We haven't made any drawdowns, so things, you know, look pretty good. And I'm guessing that as we get towards the capital plan in the winter, you know, you'll likely see from me some proposals to continue to go back to the policy of the fire truck stabilization, as well as the budget and the recreation fields. And I know the council has also asked for the minimum policy contribution into the open space. So you'll start to see, you know, I know, Mr. Chairman, as you know, we kind of took a hold on a couple of these while we were going through the pandemic years. But now that we're past that, we're going to try to get back onto the policy schedule of making those investments. Because clearly it's working in our overall financial interest.
What would cause, some of them have gone down.
Yeah.
General is down 107,000, yeah. What would cause a decrease?
Contributions? Is that what you, Chris?
Well, it's a combination, there are contributions to some of them, but also the market, we took a
Okay,
pretty
so
big hit.
it's an investment hit. More.
Yeah.
Is there a breakdown of the investments?
We have them, yes. So basically, if you look at these statements, especially take our OPEB, the big one. Sure. So Chris Sandini, Finance Director. So basically, you take the big one, the OPEB one. If you analyze and look at the breakdown, all of the losses are unrealized losses. You will see, I don't think I've ever seen it where we have a realized loss, which means we sold the stock at a loss. You always hear the old adage, you sell high, you buy low. That's basically the strategy of these various funds. So we didn't really lose money, we just lost value. Like the year before, we were gangbusters and we increased value quite a bit, so.
Kind of like my retirement account?
Yes, like your
Correct.
financial advisor tells you about stocks, George, that's right.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, just to add to that, so that is kind of mired with, because also in those numbers are any contributions. We contributed almost $1 million to our OPEB in that year. So it's just a combination of the two together.
Thank you. I lost my agenda. FY '23 budget update?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, really quickly, I added this on there just to give everybody a quick update. So the council did approve the adjusted budget that the Finance Committee did recommend in early November. They approved it on November 16th. So far, so good, as we kind of mentioned at the Finance Committee meeting. I did want to make one kind of announcement about some of the, kind of a foreshadowing possibly towards FY '24. In terms of my original fiscal forecast I put out, I kind of gave some comments on inflation. And, you know, I think one of the things people really have to realize is what you read in the newspaper is delayed significantly by the time it actually hits our books. So to illustrate that point, when we're seeing public procurement bids on supplies and when we're ordering goods and we're trying to fix and maintain buildings, a great example that just came up recently is our electricity contract was at its end in this December for the town. And we were paying just over a little bit, 10 cents per kilowatt. I had signed a 4-year contract back 4 years ago, when electricity rates were good. As you can imagine, electricity rates have spiked quite a bit. And so as an example of inflation and some of the impacts it's going to have on the budget for the remainder of the fiscal year, as well as heading into 2024, and I'm counting my blessings that we got a 13.9 cent per kilowatt rate, which sounds small. It is a very good rate. I did sign that contract for 4 years because what's important to me is stability. So now I have predictability. Fuel security is incredibly important right now. And energy security for our facilities and street lights and all the other reasons why we need it for town operations. But just to put context onto that, that is a $350,000 a year hit each year for the next 4 years over what we're paying right now. So when you think your costs only go up 2.5% every year under the revenue source of the property tax levy, we're not even talking yet about health insurance. We're not even talking yet about pension assessments. We're not even talking yet about the labor issues that I know the schools will talk about soon and that we're all seeing in terms of the costs. I just need to emphasize that is an excellent example of we have to have our feet on earth. We can't be up in the sky talking about pie in the sky ideological fights of the way life should be. The way life really is, in reality, just like every homeowner in town got lucky this year that we signed a contract a few years ago for your home electricity at 10.5 cents per kilowatt. Well, next year, families might feel that a little bit more because that contract that we signed for municipal aggregation will now come off the books. Every resident will probably pay more in electricity next winter. I know most homeowners will say, oh, well, that's next winter. I'll worry about that then. And I'm in the same boat myself. But just as context, the $350,000 hit on electricity, half of that I'm going to have to make up in this year for this year's budget. Okay? So that's going to easily be a $200,000 hit that we did not anticipate in May, and I did not anticipate that even 2 months ago. And it just perfectly illustrates how inflation can really impact municipal operations, municipal budgets, because that money that would have been spent allocated somewhere else, I now cannot buy as much supplies to fix pipes and leaky this and tiles over here and water fountains there and, you know, whatever it could be. So if folks wonder why I've put on hold any major capital projects that we require borrowing or interest rates, this is a big reason why. Because we don't really fully know, and we're getting used to it. And you'll hear Brutus next week at the council meeting. Will give his snow and ice presentation. His infamous snow and ice presentation. I saved all of you this year for that. But he's going to show again salt, sand, labor shortages, contractors, people to plow the streets. I mean, you know, these are not really discretionary things, right? There's a lot of other things we may talk about tonight or in other meetings moving forward that are really actually discretionary. These are really not discretionary items. It's just a cost of doing business. And we're seeing the same exact impacts on gas, water, other electric, other utilities as well, and we're going to see it on the cost and goods. So we know we'll do a good job managing our budgets, and at the end of June, if there are problems in accounts, you know, we'll go to the Finance Committee and the Council after the budget's set in May, and we'll do some reordering wherever there's some additional revenues that weren't spent for maybe personnel, you know, issues and stuff like that from people moving on in jobs. But you know, $350,000 for the next 4 years, right out of the gate, is for one issue like that is a pretty substantial increase that I think the committee needs to be aware of, the community needs to be aware of, and it needs to kind of give everybody at least some general sense of pause of making sure that as we move into FY24, you know, we could be seeing other issues like this really put a big hit and dent into the budget. So happy to answer any questions on that topic or the current budget as best I can, and just wanted to give that highlight. Thanks.
You mentioned that if people noticed any type of capital expenditures or things that we weren't going to move forward on, is there anything that has been brought to like our attention or to our level that is now getting peeled back?
Yeah. Nothing that I'm aware of. I think the big thing is going to be, particularly in the facilities budget, which affects both the town and the schools, because we obviously run as you know, we run the school department facilities. The real reality is that we are just simply not going to be able to fix as many problems as people want. You know, you just, you know, if somebody's out on FMLA or on a medical or something like that, I've got to fill them with a contractor of a plumber. I can assure you that the plumbing rates are not going down. You know, the electrician rates are not going down. contracting rates are not going down. So that's just going to end up resulting mainly in the facilities department, for example. It's really going to mean a significant reduction in our ability to triage problems on a day-to-day basis. It's going to have a big impact on work orders that departments put in, including the schools, on being able to fix items that 2 years ago, or actually probably items over the last decade, people have just gotten used to us fixing really quickly. And so everybody just has to be aware that as we go forward, particularly with DPW and particularly with facilities, which are the two budgets on my half that really have the most exposure, right? I think we'll know more. Essentially for DPW, the big thing to do is do your, dance to have no snow. Because a bad snow year, is going to result in a cost that is going to possibly now have some consequences come spring. So what we'll do is, in DPW's case, is if come April, we may be able to do less mowing the lawns. We may not water the lawns of the municipal properties come the spring if we're short revenue. So we'll do things like that as we go through the rest of the year. So the fields might not be able to be watered or something like that. That might save $100,000 or $200,000, which will make up for the difference in like electricity rates. But the message to the department heads has generally been that for the last couple months. They're getting a preview of the department heads meeting on December 16th. Lucas, you've already heard the message, so if you want to skip it, feel free. But in all earnest, I think everybody, for those departments that have large expense budgets, they're going to certainly be on notice throughout the rest of the year to make sure if you don't need to do something, let's just take a pause to make sure we don't get ourselves into a deeper hole come spring.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Are there other large kind of multi-year contracts that you're in the process of renewing? Are those kind of what we should be watching out more for, or are there kind of annual that, like you said, snow removal type stuff that you're more concerned about?
That's a super question. I think it's both. The good news is the main contracts for like utilities, but also collective bargaining, in terms of personnel, those are settled with the exception of one. And the electricity one was also a big cost driver. Another one that's going to hit us next year is stormwater. We all have to pay. The town doesn't get off from its own fee. And so, that's going to be another piece that's going to come into play that's going to hit every resident next year as well. But it's certainly going to hit the town. So I would say largely the multi-year ones, Tyrell, have been mostly settled. I think to your point about the year-to-year, snow and ice removal is a year-to-year thing.
Yep.
And I think we've talked about it before, but it's really hard to get people to plow snow. So that just, it's good old-fashioned cash to get people to come in and do that. And Brutus will have some, I don't have the slides in front of me, but the salt purchasing and some of those things, we have consortiums that work on those, kind of bulk purchasing. The cost is still going way up for everybody. And fuel is one that's a multi-year contract that we normally do. We've actually decided this year on fuel and diesel to just kind of pay as we go. We had an opportunity to buy into a contract earlier in the spring, and we made the good decision not to. Otherwise, we would have been paying much higher than we're actually paying right now, because fuel prices have leveled off a little bit. But I just want to make note that it's still well over $1 a gallon more today than it was a year ago. So while we all feel like, I think we probably all feel like a little relief at the pump, like just, whew, like it's not $4.50 anymore, we're not climbing up to $5, still at $3.70, we're still $1.25 higher than we were last fiscal year. But we're taking that one and just kind of seeing how it goes, because I think the geopolitical issues have kind of, I wouldn't say they've settled, but at least from a fuel perspective, they've kind of leveled off. So fortunately, we made the decision not to get into a contract. So that's a good example of the year-to-year that you were just talking about a minute ago that we will have to watch as we get to spring. And, whenever you get to a cold weather season, we all know what utility companies, they just do it. It's like, costs could go up if the demand goes up, or the supply goes down. So far so good. We should be able to do that pretty well, but that's a good example of the year-to-year that we'll be looking at in the spring for sure, to see if maybe we can enter into another multi-year agreement, hopefully if fuel prices come down more.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
I just have a quick question to play off that, actually, regarding electricity. So I think you said it was 13.4,
13.9.
13.9. So how does the town arrive at that? So do you guys use consultants to kind of measure what is the projection like over the next 4 years? Because I know the day-to-day people, we don't have access to that. So I was curious how that process looks.
I'm happy to bring our consultant in. If you think this is a deep dive, or you think the deep dive series with the schools is a deep dive, wait until you get into energy consultants, if any of you work with them. We're very lucky to have Doug. We do have a consultant on retainer that we've worked with for many, many years. He's incredibly good at what he does. We go out and do bids. So I love that question because it shows some of the strange things that I do that nobody knows, which is, and Alicia knows, I do sit in my office every day for about a month going through energy market numbers and looking at 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year. It's just like any other bid. You tell the consultant, like, what do you want to look for? Do you want a green product? Do you want to pay more for that? Do you want a brown product? What companies do you want to use? Just to illustrate that, some companies have started to institute a rider policy where they're putting in a cost driver automatic increase at certain thresholds. So you can say 13.9, but in some contracts, the company will actually then put in a fine print of I'm sorry, it sounds low again, but a 1% of 1 mil might actually drive up another $100,000, but they're putting those riders in, and we're seeing those riders obviously because utility companies are losing a lot of money a lot of places, right? Think about the company versus National Grid. The National Grid rate for a homeowner this year is about 33 cents a kilowatt. The average resident in Franklin right now is paying 10.5 cents only because we signed that agreement 3 years ago. So that company, the distributor, is losing money on us, essentially, not thinking that rates would have gotten to this point with inflation, right? So they're putting in these like little fine print riders. So you got to look at those and say, we don't want to do business with those 3 companies because they're putting those automatic cost risers in, which you can almost guarantee they're going to exercise that right, and say. And then there's other weird things in the contracts, like where you do court. If there's a lawsuit, where do you go to court? Right? We're emphatic that we go to court in Massachusetts. Texas energy companies do not want to do business in Massachusetts. They want you to go to court in Texas. I wonder why. And so you got to look at a lot of those details and kind of say to the consultant, well, we want to go out to bid for this company, this company, this company. And luckily, we've done great business with a company called Constellation as a distributor for many years. And we were fortunate enough to get a sub 14-cent rate. So that I say to the consultant, all right, what's going to pass the smell test, right, based on the average resident? Well, under 14 cents. And, every day we go out to bid, I get numbers. We're at 16 cents, 15 cents, 18 cents. You say, no, no, no. And part of the trick is you have to be ready to sign that day when you get that. It's actually the results of procurement are actually by statute prohibited from public records law because you're dealing with a global energy market, which can be very, very disruptive, as you can imagine. And so we look at those bids and we say yes, no, 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 whatever, and that's how we go through it. So we did probably maybe the entire month, end of October to all of November, just constantly every day seeing a rate sheet first thing in the morning, because global energy markets are done around the clock, and you get the numbers at like 4 a.m., 5 a.m., and stuff like that. So we still do get to frame out what we're looking for. We still do have that control. Each municipality does, and we do use a consultant who goes out and does that work for us, and we work back and forth with them to say, well, the consultant said this year, for example, I don't think a 2-year deal is probably the way to go, because inflation will come down. We expect a recession, so we might be able to hit that market in 2 years, but so you try to feel it out. I wish we could say we all are experts in this, but we're not. We're trying to kind of figure it all out, but it's an interesting process, so appreciate the question.
Yeah, thank you.
All set? Okay, next item on the agenda is our friends from the school committee. just have one thing ahead of time. And I don't know whether they can get that in. I did a graph of, this is the student population, which has dropped 22% in, I think, this 10 years there. And this, the green side, is the budget that has risen 34%. So a delta of like, I don't know whether you can compare them easily, say 50%. And I think what we'd like to get out of this is some explanation for, I'll use me, a retired guy, fixed income, obviously no kids in the schools. What is the explanation of a significant drop in pupils and a more significant rise in the costs? That's what I think I would like to come out of this with. I will say that I've spent the last 3 or 4 days reading more about the Franklin schools than I ever wanted to know. Most of it hieroglyphics in my mind. I get on the DESE site and you really get hieroglyphics, but I've been there. So with that, go for it.
I will say it's a little odd being on this side, so. All right, so good evening. My name is Denise Spencer. I am the proud chair of the Franklin School Committee. I am joined by Superintendent Lucas Jagir, our school business administrator, Miriam Goodman, and my fellow school committee member, Dave McNeil, who is also the chair of our budget subcommittee. I'd like to thank Chairman Conley and the full committee for inviting us here this evening to be a part of this deep dive series. I think having this type of presentation here at Finance Committee is hitting an audience that we don't usually get who watch the school committee meetings, so I hope this is helpful to the community who has tuned in tonight. We do have a number of slides to go over this evening, but I did want to share some additional information beforehand, just for you. I know at past Finance Committee meetings, the question of declining enrollment has come up, and I believe I can expand on our previous superintendent, Dr. Sarah Ahern's responses in the past. Back in May of this year, committee members Hanson and Riley asked to see how specifically the needs have grown, and we have put together slides per your request, so we'll get to those in a few minutes. A decrease in enrollment doesn't equal a decreased budget. Not every student costs the same to educate because their needs and abilities are drastically different. They're individuals. We don't have cookie-cutter students. It's not that simple. The number of staff has increased. Added interventionists and the like at the elementary level can intervene earlier and sooner, meaning that they may not need a referral for support services down the line in middle or high school. It's fiscally responsible to focus on prevention in this area. Instead of one teacher, we now need a team of experienced individuals supporting our students. We are responsible for providing so much more nowadays than academics, than the typical reading, writing, and arithmetic, just from when I was in school 20 plus years ago. We're also responsible for mental health services, food insecurities, just as 2 examples. You know, we're mandated by the state to provide more. Unfortunately, unfunded mandates. I know we love saying that word, but here we are, it's a truth. Special education costs are also increasing. Just as an example, we recently received notice from the Operational Services Division of the state's Executive Office of Administration and Finance that our special education costs, which have risen on average of about 2% each year over the last several, are now going to be going up by 14%. As an example of public schools being responsible for areas beyond academics, I'd also like to point to the latest results of the Metro West Adolescent Health Survey, which is a biennial survey of middle and high school students. Reports of serious mental health problems increased sharply since the last survey. Depressive symptoms rose from 20% in 2018 to 27% in 2021. Intentional self-injury rose from 14% to 19%, and seriously considering suicide increased from 13% to 16%. At a recent town meeting, I know our police chief spoke about the benefit of having additional social workers within their department, and that they've seen a large spike in mental health calls. And I think that this highlights, as a community, as a whole, we have a greater need for mental health services, and these needs trickle down to our children and students. All of this data confirms that the needs of students have increased. That has to be factored into an operational budget. We have to listen to what they're telling us. Students are showing us they need more resources. We have done our best to ensure that we focus on our students who have the highest needs, to close the achievement and opportunity gaps, and to ensure fair wages for staff. We're still emerging from 2 years of a pandemic with learning loss, academic regression, and severe mental health challenges. We're putting resources into those areas as they are the needs our students have, and it is our responsibility. I'd just like to finish up by thanking everyone within the Franklin Public Schools for all they've had to do over the past several years. They've done so much for our community. As a mom, I'd like to thank them. They've done so much for my family. I'd like to thank our central office and our budget subcommittee for their work on pulling together our fiscally responsible budget. And now I'd like to turn it over to Superintendent Jagir.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you once again for having us. So our hope is by the end of this, Mr. Conlon, we're able to answer some of those questions and present just some other information important about the Franklin Public Schools that adds context to the presentation that we shared ahead of time. So you've heard opening remarks. As part of the whole puzzle, we'll spend some time just talking through how we're funded through Chapter 70, talk through enrollment and some of our selected populations, and then provide an overview of some of the other areas within our school budget. So hopefully by the end, we've shared just an overview, a deeper dive on how we assemble our budget, what it entails, and then our approach this year, and as well as some other updates, and leave time at the end for questions as well. So before we begin, we wanted to talk about the major driver of our budget is really around what do we hope for our kids, right? We're, just like any organization, we have a mission, we have a vision for what we want as a school system, and in this town, there's a high expectation, as there should be, on the education we provide to the kids in this town, myself included. And we have a portrait of a graduate, so we developed a vision. And within these, you'll see the tenets below, which talk about being confident and self-aware, empathetic and productive citizens, curious and creative thinkers, effective communicators and collaborators, and reflective and innovative problem solvers. Those are, at this point, to you, maybe just bullets on the slide, but we really incorporate these in how we think about where we'll deploy resources, how we'll develop our plans for our school year, and how we'll prepare students throughout each level of their development. Moving on, you heard a little bit from Ms. Spencer about the pandemic recovery. These are areas we're still continuing to focus on. We have seen an uptick in some of the mental health needs and supports of our students. Prior to the pandemic, we were focused on social emotional learning. When I was in school, I think we called it character ed, or it's had different names along the way. Some have called them soft skills. I've heard different names, but ultimately, that idea we were working on. I think that was a huge contributor to some of the ways we were able to sustain during some of the harder times of the pandemic. With that said, upon return, mental health is shown and manifests itself in different ways with kids. I'm just thinking about some of the visits I've done at some of the schools as part of my transition, and one of the things is around resilience. That would be a pattern I've already heard around students and trying to stick with them in their learning, and trying to make sure that we don't let students fall behind so that they can achieve at the highest level that we want them to and that we know they can. That ties in with the academic interventions. And then also, you'll hear a little bit more about the continued support of technology as we get to the next slide around some of our planning. It's actually the slide after this. So we recognize that our kids have growing needs. And when we think about how we prepare kids, we look at not only the academic side, but we look at the behavioral side and social emotional side. Those are two ways. So we have more intensive needs. You've heard that stated tonight. We'll talk a little bit about that and add some statistical information to that to hopefully paint the full picture. We have an increase in our English language learner population that we provide support for across levels, and also we're really looking to try to support all students as we continue to plan. This year we have 5 major district initiatives. We really wanted to put together a solid plan, and one thing I would say is we've really worked on a focus on creating tiered systems of support. You may have heard it, there's acronyms for it. MTSS is one that's used most commonly, but ultimately what we're trying to do is establish tier 1, meaning how are we educating all kids? And if we can do that at a very high level, we have the best shot of educating and having a system that really provides the absolute best education they can. Tier 2, in every scenario, students who can't at first maybe demonstrate mastery or understanding of a skill, we start to look at and identify who those kids are, and then we provide support in the moment to try to help support them. That's what I think Ms. Spencer was referring to when she talked about a team. It's not just one person who's doing that, but trying to really make sure that we're rounding off, and then getting students right back to that tier 1 level. And then tier 3 is for our students who need more support, and then how do we structure it. So I offer that as a framework, just as we think through some of the positions that we'll talk about later in the presentation. You'll see some other references to that, but really, as we've come out of the pandemic, what we've realized is our systems are really an area that we wanted to focus on. As we design our plan for the year, how are we establishing the right adults to help students across the board with our systems? And you can have a lot of goals, but if you don't have systems in line to meet them, then that's just what they are, their goals. So we really tried to focus on pairing what do we want for kids, and then how are we going to support that moving forward. This year, all of our elementary schools aligned to create a common school improvement plan so that we can have a guaranteed experience that's common across all of our elementary schools for students as they continue through grades. Also, our middle school did that as well. We've covered that in some of our school committee meetings, but for the purposes of tonight, I just would talk about how we, by having common goals, we're able to really focus in on having common resources and creating initiatives that are aligned and allow us to deploy similar resources across schools for equity. Now we'll get into the Chapter 70 funding.
Thanks for having us tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about Chapter 70. I know you've heard me talk about that at every budget hearing that I've been to in the last 15 years, but it is really important to repeat this information. It's complicated information, and I feel like the more that I can tell it to folks for your sake, for the public's sake, maybe you'll pick up, or the public will pick up one more piece of information relative to how we're funded. So Chapter 70 is the state's way of determining how much they're going to fund for our district. They start with and calculate a foundation budget, which is the amount that they think is an adequate funding level to provide an education to the students of Franklin. That this year takes into account the second year of the implementation of the student opportunity.
Can I interrupt? There's an echo. Maybe move them, somewhere. Yeah, that's better.
That better?
I think so.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah,
So the foundation budget.
That's all right. We're just hearing it twice. That's no problem.
Even more important. So this is the second year of the implementation of the Student Opportunity Act, which provided higher foundation rates in 5 areas. Low-income students for English learners, special education, benefits and fixed charges, and guidance. And so they take those categories, they've increased the rates, they multiply it by the number of students we have in each of those categories, come up with an amount that they think is adequate for us to provide an education for our students. Then they decide what can Franklin afford to pay towards that amount, and then they backfill the rest with state aid. So stated a little bit differently here is the actual formula that the foundation is based on an enrollment and a wage adjustment factor and inflation. From that, what Franklin can afford to pay is based on an aggregate wealth model, which includes wealth from property and income, as well as a municipal revenue growth factor. And they take the difference between those two and say, we're going to give you the rest in Chapter 70 money. Now, you can see by the numbers, 62 million less 44.8 million is not $28 million. It is $17 million. That's calculated by the formula. We should be getting $17.6 million, but in reality, we're getting $28.5 million in Chapter 70 money because we benefited by a spike in enrollment from the 90s when ed reform came into play. And the state is holding us harmless. They are not going to decrease the amount of state aid they're giving us. They will only, at this point, going forward, give us a minimum aid amount of what the Student Opportunity Act says is $30 per pupil. Just so happens that last year, for this year's budget, minimum aid was determined by the legislature at the last hour to be $60 per pupil. So an additional $155,000 came into the town of Franklin. So our minimum aid was $310,000. That's what came in on top of our Chapter 70 allocated amount from last year. Brings us to $28.8 million in Chapter 70 money that came in for FY23. That's $11.2 million more than we should be getting based on the formula. Adding back in what we're required to spend on students, that $44 million, the Chapter 70 aid we get plus what we're required to spend is going to be what our required net school spending is calculated at, which is $73.6 million. That's the amount we have to spend on educating students in Franklin to meet the compliance that the state sets forth for net school spending. And you're going to see in a minute that we're spending more than that.
Can I, sorry,
So,
can I-
sure.
Can we pause for questions randomly? Sorry, there's so much content here that I don't know if it's better. And let me know if it's helpful to save everything for the end. Is this paper?
It's all right, you can go for it.
I know this has got brought up in the past, and maybe other members can correct me if I'm not thinking of it. In the past, we've talked about, we knew we were getting more Chapter 70 money based off of that spike in growth that you mentioned, but we had, I thought historically talked about, could they take that away? But I think we're saying they will not take that away, or is that, can that still happen?
Oh, the state could decide to take it away. It's
Okay.
not likely that it will happen, but it's
they still
certainly
can.
possible.
Okay, so all right,
Sure.
so I just
Sure.
wanted to clarify that point, because I thought we said they couldn't drop below that, but we're saying they could essentially still. Because I know that was a concern in the past, so just.
Yeah, no, and I think it's important to note too that in New York recently, they're petitioning to reformulate because they realize that it's imbalanced and there are districts that need the money more than the wealthier communities. So I think it's important that we not draw too much attention that we're getting this extra money because the state reps for these other districts could make the push at the state level and we could lose this money.
Okay, thank you.
So, and I'm going to show you this also, again, in some different formats. So we are a minimum aid district, as I said. The impact of the Student Opportunity Act has been different among different communities. It's a very different impact in Franklin. We're seeing some additional circuit breaker reimbursement for transportation. We're seeing charter school reimbursement going into the town to offset some of the assessment. And we're seeing an increase to the local required contribution. And here again is the 11.2 million in excess base aid that we just talked about. We are second to Boston alone, who is getting $41.7 million more than formulated. And then there's some other districts that are listed there as well that you can see. So this just restates everything that I've just said. Our enrollment is declining. It went down 2.1% from last year to this year. Our foundation budget is increasing because the state says we need more money to adequately educate our students, so that went up 4.5%. Our required district contribution went up 5.5%. And our Chapter 70 money only went up 1.09%. So that's pretty critical information, and you're going to see that trend on the next slide as to our required district contribution continuing to go up over time until it caps at 82.5%, roughly coming in about 2028. And then just a little bit about net school spending. As I said, the net school spending is what we're required to spend, our local required contribution, plus what the state gives us in state aid. That's what we're required to spend, and that was roughly $73.6 million. So last year we spent 8.8, sorry, I meant to say an FY21, I get my years. We're in FY23 right now, but in FY21, we spent $8.8 million more than net school spending. It's a substantial amount of money. It is 12.7% more than we are required to spend. But on average, in the state of Massachusetts, 77% of districts spend more than that. In fact, they spend on average 39.3% more than net school spending. So that really puts us in the 23rd percentile as it relates to net school spending. Another statistic we talk about is our per pupil cost, our in-district per pupil cost for
Quick
2021.
question.
Sure.
So net school spending just means we have to spend that.
Net school spending is the amount that we are required to spend to
Yeah.
comply with the law.
We don't have to spend more than that, but
That's correct. You don't
Okay.
have to spend more than that, but we are spending roughly $9 million more than that. Most districts are spending an average of 39% more than they have to spend.
okay.
The per pupil comparison to the state average is $18,556. In Franklin, we're spending $15,982 per pupil. That's almost 14% lower than the state average. Puts us in the 27th percentile. So 73% of districts in Massachusetts spend more on education on a per pupil basis than we do in Franklin. And that's just a visual of where we are. If you listed the names of all of those districts on a slide, that's where we fall.
But just out of curiosity, where does Franklin fall within, say, academics compared to all these other districts that are spending more than us? Aren't we near the top?
I'll let the superintendent answer that, but I'd say we're probably pretty close to the top.
No,
So-
we're a successful district in many ways.
Absolutely.
Okay.
On the, yeah, it's a longer answer, but.
I
think it's on the-
figured, but
Yeah,
it
it's
just,
not,
I understand numbers, and you can make them say what you want to say a lot of the time, but if you're achieving your goals and you're not needing to spend as much as others, even though they're spending more, what difference does it make?
I think it's on the backs of a lot of people who are stretched pretty thin to do what they need to do with the resources that we have, and we do the best we can and put the best laid plans. We have great teachers and leaders and supports that you'll hear about today that are part of that success. So I think that would be my short answer for the purposes of it, but I'm happy to expound on that later.
Okay, thanks.
I have a quick question too while we're on spending. If we went to the state average, which is it on the 44 million or the 70? All right, we spend $70 million, which includes the state aid, the Chapter 70 stuff. If we were to go meet the state average of 18.5, if it's at the $44 million range, that's another it's about $7 million more. If it's at the 70 range, it's at almost $10 million more. Could you find a way to spend that money?
Sure.
Does the sun rise in the east?
I mean, whereas
If we
Are you
set a
kidding?
$100 million, we could spend that money.
I believe that if I calculated this a couple of years ago in a presentation, and it was close to $81 million if we were just average, just based on the state average, maybe three or 4 years ago, and it brought our budget up to $81 million. And there were lots of opportunities that we could come up with, like having an elementary foreign language program, for one quick example. We don't teach a foreign language at the elementary level. It's something that we had many years ago, but we don't anymore. It's one of the reductions we've made over time. We eliminated librarians. We have one librarian in the district. That might be something. So could we spend an extra
have to-
11 million?
well-
Sure.
My point, I guess, is I would consider us a high-performing district based on everything I've read over the last 2 weeks. It would almost seem like it's throwing money away to strive to get to that number. And I think those numbers are a little suspect anyway, when you have Provincetown and Cambridge and those people spending $40,000 a student. So I was just curious, what would we ever do prudently with $10 or $12 million more?
Well,
And
then the
it's-
second question to that is, what does that increase us with? Are we gonna rise up in state rankings? Are we gonna do better SATs? Are students gonna be happier?
Yeah, the other side of that is if you don't reach that, and I'm guessing the average is not in memorialized in law anywhere. It's a goal. If you don't get to it in some form or other, is there a penalty? And I'll go back, I've used the thing not so long ago, the library had to spend, I forget the number, $1 million plus or minus. If we didn't get to the state requirement, then they snapped accreditation. We got there and it works. Is there a penalty, a true either dollar and cents, educational or whatever penalty for not getting to a certain number unknown? And that may be just a hypothetical question right now.
Nope,
You
it's
don't
true.
need- Yeah, is there a penalty?
Yes,
And it
there
is?
is. If you do not meet net school spending, if you fall below 95% of net
And
school
I didn't,
spending,
that's not my question.
will
Is
require.
if we go to the state average, let's say. Okay, the numbers I kind of did in my head were to get to the state average. If we don't get to this quote state average, is there a penalty? I'm not talking about anything but the state average. Other
State
than,
average is just
other
an
than that,
average.
we're on a
So
chart.
the only
We're-
penalty
we're
comes
down.
if we don't meet the NSS.
If you don't meet net school spending, there is a
Okay.
penalty.
That's,
So yeah, there's no penalty.
yeah, okay.
And
That
I
was-
think too, just, which I think is what maybe you were getting at, Michael, too, is, yeah, we're below it, but how efficiently are we spending the money? Like maybe, right, I think then that's where we talk about meeting our goals, and so on paper, it looks, well, this town's spending it more, well, they could be spending it much more foolishly than we are, right? So I think we just have to keep that in mind when we look at the per pupil, because I know we tend to go towards that, and I myself have a whole list of questions on per pupil, but I think that's important, is just how efficiently are those funds being spent when you look at it district to district.
Okay, guys.
So this is just a summary of our current budget, $70,220,825. As you can see, the majority is spent on salaries, with healthcare being the second largest bucket. 5% on out-of-district tuition, 4.25% on other expenses, 3.5% on transportation. And then just a summary of our revolving account balances. At June 30th, we had about $7.5 million in revolving accounts. Revolving accounts are accounts that are fee-based. Their revenue comes in from specific fees like transportation, like athletic fees, like fees for extracurricular activities, fees for preschool tuition. Those go into a revolving fund, and they are used to offset the expenses in those categories. Our budgeted use for FY '23 is $5.5 million. our projected receipts for FY '23 are 4.7, so we're anticipating a projected balance in our revolving accounts at year end to be roughly $6.7 million. It's about 10% of our total budget.
Interrupt you again, I'm sorry. Revolving accounts is I'll call it a pet peeve. It's mostly, well, let's take athletics or buses. It's obvious that because the numbers say so, that we're charging more than we should be, or we shouldn't. If we're charging what the expense is, then we should end up with a zero balance at the end of the year. There shouldn't be carryover anything. And yet, we're gonna have $6.7 million, which is, I don't know, the percentages of, how do you come up with, or how do you justify charging? I'll give you an example. I had a niece who lived at 110 Union Street, which is not a bad walk, but a pretty good walk to the high school. They had to pay for the bus to go from 110 Union Street to the high school. They were the last house, I think. And the number was like $300. Is that what a bus ride for a student costs to go from 110 Union to 218 Oak Street? And if it isn't, how do we, I mean, in effect, it looks to me like taxation without representation. We're taking money, but we spend it next year, right? Some of that money that we collect gets spent next year, not this year, not to cover this year's expenses. So in effect, a graduating senior from high school who pays a bus fee paid for his friend who's a junior for next year. And I guess it just doesn't seem fair to me. And whether fair is a legitimate thing in this discussion, I don't know. But how do we come up with the fee? For instance, what is a fee now for a bus? For a typical, I mean, the bus contract is only, I think if my memory serves, it's around 2.5 million, plus or minus 3, I don't know. I'm doing it from memory, okay, I haven't, and.
Can I add some points onto that? Because I think, so this year, right, if you just do your budgeted for use versus your projected receipts, you're actually down. You're spending more, so like you're eating away at that excess. I guess what's the process for, do you look at some point and say FY '23, what did I collect for bus, what I spent for bus, how do we need to adjust our bus fee? And then how does that roll into the next year, but how did we possibly get $7.5 million off? I think that's the biggest discrepancy. It's like, fine, you're floating around $500,000, fine. Like that's your kind of cushion. But I think the issue is that it ballooned so much.
Right, so first I'll tell you that the school committee's philosophy since I've been here for 15 years has been keeping a year of revolving accounts in the bank. That was based from a forensic audit that was done close to 15 years ago that indicated that when you're spending money as it comes in, you have to make adjustments during the course of that school year if your revenue projections are off. So at that point in time, the auditors who completed the forensic audit indicated that the philosophy of keeping that 1 year in the bank. Okay, so that's why the transportation money that we take in this year does in fact go towards next year's expenses. We take in $360 per pupil. That's for fees that parents can choose to pay or can choose to transport their child to school in some other fashion. We don't require parents to pay for busing other than those who are living within the 2-mile mark or in grades 7 through 12, K through 6 within 2 miles. Secondly, it costs roughly $760 per pupil to transport a student on a big yellow bus. The contract is about $1.5 million. We're also transporting students in vans. We don't charge students to be transported in vans to specialized programs. The revolving account for transportation offsets the cost of transportation and is used for that cost. And we will be as fiscally responsible as we can to utilize that money. Part of that $7.5 million that you're seeing there is 1 year in the bank for a circuit breaker reimbursement. So for those of you who might not be familiar with circuit breaker is a reimbursement that comes from the state to cover the costs of extraordinary tuition for out-of-district placement costs. You heard Ms. Spencer talk about the operational service division increasing costs next year by 14% for private specialized special education placements. So the state also reimburses a portion of that cost in circuit breaker. So this year our circuit breaker is roughly $3.1 million of that $7.5 million. So keeping 1 year in the bank has always been the philosophy since I've been here. I will say that we have a little bit more than 1 year in the bank in some accounts, and we are being fiscally conservative about how we spend it, and you'll see that later on as we start to talk about how we're going to build our FY24 budget so that we can be fiscally responsible with the funds that we have. And we're also going to talk about some of the grant funding that we have that can support our budget as well.
Strangely enough, if that was in the regular budget, or is it in the regular budget? I remember there's a line at the bottom, so it's not.
The revolving counts are completely within the school department's jurisdiction to spend, allocate.
So they're not the 44 million that we contribute, doesn't include the.
Exactly. I think as the slide says, it's like 10 or 11%, there is 10.8% of the overall budget. So if you go back to that pie, however they're spending that money is distributed throughout those different uses.
So strangely enough, if we put it in the budget and collected it, and I'm gonna say through taxes or whatever, that would raise our that 18 number that we're aiming at would go up. We'd go closer to it, wouldn't we? If we paid for the buses through the regular budget, and I understand that's all kinds of different, I'm just blue skying here.
Ultimately, at the end of the day, I believe that that's just shell moving. It's just kind of moving shells around, shuffling chairs to shuffle chairs, because ultimately their final budget at whatever it is, 73 million, includes that, 7 million,
So
give or
that's what I'm saying.
take.
It is in the.
It's in their budget
so to
proposal, right? It's in their budget proposal, so it's kind of off the town. If you were to do it that way, you'd have to have it on the revenue sheet. It would be other votes, whatever that's called, it'd be a line item at the bottom. But you'd just be increasing the town budget, say 7 million, and plopping in the 7 million from that. So it's really 6, 1/2 dozen the other. It just makes it easier actually to not have it do that way.
Sometimes you have to think out of the box. So, okay, go for it. But continue going.
So, this is your question of the day, Mr. Conley.
Yeah.
So the blue bars that you see represent the number of students in our district that in FY09 was roughly 6,100 or so. And in FY23 is roughly 47, in fact 4,725 students. The fatter, jagged gray line indicates the number of members in our FEA Unit A.
Okay.
That
there's a Unit A and a
Yep.
Unit B.
Yep, there's a Unit A and there's a Unit B, and there's plenty of other staff that are outside of units. But our Unit A members are our teachers, our gen ed teachers, special educators, occupational therapists, speech therapists, physical therapists, digital learning
Professionals.
integrationists, counselors, school psychologists. They are all Unit A members. So while you see that trend line is in fact increasing in the in the FEA staff members, the enrollment for students is going down. The differential you'll see on the next slide is this is our classroom teachers, okay? Our classrooms, our students, again, the blue bars, you can see that that gray line, which identifies the number of classroom teachers, has in fact kept up with the decline in student enrollment. The differential is those other related service providers that you're gonna see in a minute, and how they've changed over time. So we might have eliminated some classroom teachers based on enrollment, but we've added a counselor here and there, and nurses, and psychologists,
Special
and
education.
other special educators. And so
And
this
you're
is at the
saying that's at
elementary.
the elementary level?
This is at the
Added them?
elementary level, 19.4 is your average class size.
No, my question is this gray bar just represents classroom teachers
At the elementary level.
at the elementary level. You've
Correct.
added those other ones that you're speaking at the elementary level?
At all levels. All of those other related service providers
Is
and
it
special
possible to get
educators.
a graph of what that looks like on this as
Um,
well?
We can, I don't have one here tonight, but we
Alright.
can certainly put that together at the elementary level, at the secondary level.
Yeah.
The next slide shows you the same data at the middle school level, where our enrollment has kept up. Our number of classroom teachers at the middle school level has kept up with our middle school classroom enrollment, and the average class size is 19.9 this year. And the reasoning behind some of those added positions is because of the selected population enrollment that we're about to talk about. So this yellow bar that you see on this table indicates our enrollment
school?
in the 90s. Sorry?
Is there a high school graph?
There's not a high school graph. High school, the classrooms with the block scheduling the way it is, the number of classroom teachers, the average classroom size, I would say, is probably in the same range, with some classes being higher than 19 and a half and some lower, but it's harder for me to
graph because,
quantify that way.
Like students
because
in an elementary are assigned to an elementary teacher, and in the middle school you have teams. At high school, you might remember when you rotate through, so you can get an average of class sizes, but it's not as clean as some of the graphs that we show. But that's something that we can look to try to represent.
I mean, even if you just do it simple, like students, classroom teachers, others.
Yep.
Sure. So,
Who determines high needs, and what is high needs?
we're-
The link at the bottom actually leads to that. The DESE has determined. You'll notice the hashtags, I'm sorry, the NAs,
Yeah.
where there wasn't even a category considered in the 90s for high needs, and even in the early 2000s, so.
Okay, so
So
they determine
the
what
Department of Ed.
what criteria creates a high needs
Right.
person.
So 93, 94 is when ed reform came into play. We had just under 4,000 students at that point in time. 2008, 2009 was when our highest enrollment peak occurred. And you can see those different categories of students. And in 21, 22, just last year, our total enrollment was 4,764 students. But, just for an example, students with disabilities at 506 in the 90s and now up to 892. Low-income students at 190 in 93, 94, and now up to 704. So our population has certainly changed over the years.
On that low income, what determines that as well, and what are the additional expenses generally that we need to support them?
So there are federal poverty guidelines that there's a percentage that the department quantifies as low-income students on an annual basis. And in terms of other expenses that we would need to support, I'm sure you can see some of the statistics about students coming from poverty and their academic performance and other trauma. So there are additional services that might be required to support them. Certainly, we support them with free and reduced meals, that kind of thing.
Does a lot of that excess or increased cost for low-income housing, not housing, but low-income students, do we get extra funding from the state for that? So is it, or I guess also to add on to that, do we get extra funding, and is it dollar for dollar? I'm assuming it's not, but how close to dollar for dollar is it? Like, are we feeling that impact of, as that population grows, are we feeling that? I'm guessing it's yes, but just curious your thoughts on how that reconciles with what we get with state funding.
Yeah, so the Student Opportunity Act, that was one of the categories that they increased the rate for, because they knew that they weren't keeping up with the rate and the expenses that we were needing to spend on low-income students. And so the rate was adjusted in the Student Opportunity, so that basically increased the foundation and said, hey, this is, I'm gonna tell you it's gonna cost you more to provide an adequate education, or here's an adequate amount to provide an education, and it's gonna be higher, but because we're a minimum aid district, we're not gonna get any more than that $30 per pupil. We're just gonna have to contribute more, that percentage that's going up to 82.5%. We're just gonna have to contribute more. So the foundation's gonna go up, but Franklin as a community, the state has said we can afford more to pay more. So we'll just be contributing more over time.
Yep, so if we want to maintain our level of education as that population grows, we're not necessarily getting that from the state. We're compensating for that as that grows. Thank you.
If I can too, just through the chair, to address Committee Member Hanson's comment, you had mentioned the free and reduced meals, but it's not just that. It also helps determine if a family needs to pay for their bus cost or Chromebook insurance or sports fees, after-school fees. There's a lot of things that families can qualify for through filling out some paperwork. So it really does kind of help a lot of our students in the community.
Okay.
Thank you. Good point. So here is the background that I talked about a few minutes ago on our specialized positions. Although we're continuing to support fewer students, they have greater needs, and they're supported with additional special educators, which you can see in the past 6 years have gone from 81 to 99.4 special educators in terms of FTE. Our school adjustment counselors from 7.2 to up to 20 adjustment counselors, and our nurses from 11 to 16.
What's a school adjustment counselor?
So it's basically a licensed counselor through the DESE that helps students navigate the school day, works with them to support mental health, meets with students and families to bring them together in support of kids on a variety of issues related to school in some capacity. But ultimately, they're there to support the mental health and behavioral needs of kids across the district, and they exist at all levels.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So just to follow up on that, if you look at this, we talked a little bit about the types of roles we have in the building. So as we talked a little bit about classroom teachers and how we've really tried to be responsible in keeping up with our enrollment when it comes to classroom, the question, once again, Mr. Conley poses around some of these other areas that fill out the needs of a kid throughout a school day are where some of our resources have shifted over time. So you'll see on here, school adjustment, you'll see reading specialists, some of our related service providers, so our occupational therapists, right, our physical therapists, curriculum, we're an academic institution, learning's our primary focus, and teaching and learning is really what what we need to be doing is supporting our teachers in that to provide the best education we can. You'll also see some other components in there around school psychologists, and our curriculum specialists include math and literacy specialists at our elementary level, reading at the middle, and then as we get into the high school, we also have our department heads and directors across the board to help support programming and teaching and learning. And also our EL, which is our English language learners or our multilingual teachers to support our growing population in Franklin across the board at all levels. So this is just, I talked about this earlier, I'll be succinct on this. Ultimately, this is just a visual to talk through those tiers that we mentioned. So really, tier one is when we think about the classroom teacher. You know, how are they preparing and teaching students? As you get into tier two, it could be other supports that are available to kids. These aren't labeled by role, so you're not a teacher who's a tier two teacher necessarily. But if you're supporting kids, our English language learner teachers are actually helping in the first tier. How are we preparing lessons for students so that they can acquire, and they have the language objectives in addition to the learning objectives, for example, that are occurring. And those are some of the supports that folks may wonder about, or I've been asked about, what does an English language learner teacher do? They're supporting someone who's learning the language while they're in classes with their peers being educated. They're providing the pre-teaching, reteaching, and whatnot. So that's an example. Special education, I would apply the same pieces around pre-teaching and reteaching and providing support and helping, partnering with classroom teachers to prepare lessons to account for the kids that are in front of them on that day. This is just another example. It's a dental analogy. So we all know that we all go to school, we all go to the dentist and we have cleanings and checkups, right? And that's just something that occurs all the time. If you have a cavity or you need braces, you go get braces, but you don't stop having your teeth cleaned over time. So when we start to think about these models, it's everyone's getting the instruction they need across the board, all kids. And if someone needed something else, we would look to provide that, but then get them back to, ultimately you only want people to have their teeth cleaned, if that in a perfect world, but we know that that's not always the case. So this model represents, and then a root canal is obviously like a deeper, more intensive intervention, but even with a root canal, you should still be cleaning your teeth and having that done. So this is just an example of that model of how we try to look at when we're educating kids. And there's a lot of people involved to make that model work.
Do you have any information around how many people are using those services and have gotten off of them?
Yes, actually, I'm glad you asked that question. We just instituted a new program called Panorama. I talked about systems earlier, if you remember when we were talking about goal setting. So what it does is we now have excellent data on that we're gathering around pre and post, basically. So we have what's called, I don't want to use another acronym, I apologize. It's called MAP testing, where it's an academic test where we can look and see where kids are at. Then in addition, teachers are teaching and they're identifying where kids are at. And then we have folks who work in our building that are interventionists at the elementary level. So during a common block, they can identify where a kid needs help in a specific skill, pull groups that have a common, if we all had a common area where we struggled in math on a concept, they can pull those students who have a common need, teach, get them back. And I think that ties into when you hear like pandemic recovery teaching, we're really thinking about let's not just start kids over, let's continue to teach, but then find out where kids need help. And all of that's part of that system and that structure where we're trying to make sure we're we're designing our organization to meet those needs while still being fiscally responsible and thinking about enrollment and the adults we truly need in front of our kids. So.
Thank you.
So when we talk about coronavirus relief funding, I'm going to give you some information as to where we are at this point with our federal grants. This is the timeline for spending those federal grants. We are in the middle of fiscal year 23, where that big red arrow is. Our ESSER money for ESSER 3 is mostly what is still available to us to spend up through the end of September 2024. We are currently just finishing up spending our ESSER 2 money. So we've already spent our CVRF money in FY21. We spent our FY22, our ESSER 1 money in FY22. You can see the things that are listed there and what we spent that money on. You could go to the next one. For ESSER 2, as of November 30th, as of tomorrow, that money will all be spent because we're issuing payroll tomorrow. So that money will be spent tomorrow on those items that you see. And the ESSER 3 money is what we still have roughly $908,000 left in ESSER 3 that we are planning to continue to use it to spend on a counselor for the Bridge for Resilient Youth in Transition program. plus some support professionals for that program, continued support for interventionists, funding for interventionists. Our diversity, equity, and inclusion director is funded out of ESSER 3 money. We have a social worker in that grant, and we are going to be providing some after-school tutoring at the secondary level using ESSER 3 money.
Can I ask a question on that? So what happens with these things when these funds are gone?
Yeah, so we are going to make some decisions as to whether those positions, how those positions can be incorporated into our budget, or which positions, as we do on an annual basis, look at all of our staffing and our positions and make enrollment-driven staffing decisions as to how we're going to meet our budget allocation. So while there are some additional positions that you see funded by federal grants, we would make those decisions and either roll them in or make some decisions about our staffing at that point.
Got it. And do the people who, like, so, for example, the DEI director, do they know they're hired under this funding?
Absolutely.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
We also have other federal funds that people do know that they're funded under. This is just a summary of our ESSER funding, because that is the topic of the day.
What does ESSER stand for?
Elementary and secondary.
School. Okay. never
Yeah,
mind.
sorry, not at the tip of my tongue, but I will tell you that ARP, on the next slide, ARPA money, that's the American Rescue Plan.
Okay. That one I knew.
That's the second set of funding that schools and towns have received. Our ARPA money that we have right now remaining is roughly $163,000 between both of these school age and preschool grants, and you can see the items that we're spending that money on, again, used through the 2024 fiscal year, so through the end of probably September, but we'll probably have it spent by the end of June of next year. And so to your question, Ms. Riley, as we look to strategize in terms of FY24 budget development, we would look at all of our student enrollment trends and staff accordingly. We would be fiscally responsible in terms of how we're going to use our grant and revolving funds, as we do every year, reviewing all of our faculty and staff positions, and we will also consider the impact of the redistricting analysis outcomes that we are in the process of talking about.
This is just a timeline of events. As you may know, Franklin Public Schools is in the process of conducting a redistricting analysis. We've basically, to walk through this timeline, we had a space needs facilities assessment subcommittee, which was comprised of school committee members, myself, and Ms. Goodman, and basically determined that the recommendation was we needed to analyze our spaces and look at our schools and make some decisions on where students are laid out within the town, what makes the most sense, what's the most efficient, where can we have some efficiencies. So we hired a company, as you can see here, called Applied Geographics, who's worked a ton in Massachusetts with schools to conduct this type of analysis and lead communities through this process. We had a kickoff meeting in November. We also have had working group meetings with a smaller group in the company to get the data they need to help us, and we continue to do that. And ultimately, we have another meeting before the holiday break, the winter break, and we'll continue through the winter with the end goal of this year is to propose scenarios to school committee for them to vote. The final decision on any type of redistricting is that of the school committee, but we're facilitating this through multiple opportunities for our community. We have a redistricting advisory committee comprised of stakeholders, families, community members on that committee, the small group as a steering committee, but then ultimately we have some public forums as well to engage our community further. We have a website that's going online with more information. We'll continue to share that out, but that's basically the process, and we hope by April to arrive at some decisions around that that will lead to recommendations for future years.
I have a question.
Sure.
of the other things I did read was the entire report on, I forget who did it, the one that recommended that Davis Thayer go away. They also
Kessel
kind of
Booth.
recommended that Parmet to go away. When you redistrict, are you redistricting to the existing buildings? Or is part of the redistricting to look at that study also? Because it would seem to make sense to look at that study. And I understand those just saying it is a hot button. But it would seem to make sense when you're redistricting anyway, that we go back and look at what they said shouldn't be here anymore. I'll leave it at that.
So, through the chair, we are in the still very early stages of this entire process. The facilities analysis that we did do in the previous, for Davis Thayer, we will use that information as part of any of our research, but right now it's far too early. We haven't conducted.
But it will be an element.
It could be, yes.
Could be.
It could be. Anything could be an element. It's all up in the air right now.
I would just say examining space, short-term and long-term, because you need to be thinking. So the idea of examining our teachable spaces across our town and looking at what we have available, plus our enrollment, plus all those factors.
Yep.
That report is a piece. There's specialized programs to consider. There's an early childhood center. All of these are different factors that need to be considered as you conduct an analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And I guess to further that a little is one of my questions here. So, I guess, and maybe you're trying to get at this too, when AppGeo provides their analysis, and I am part of that committee, thank you, it's been great so far. So they're going, and how I understood it is they're going to essentially look at our map, right, and they're gonna draw lines and they do their whole thing, right? Will we ultimately, and George, correct me if this is maybe what you're thinking, get a version of, okay, these are the proposals if we don't factor in that prior analysis, and these are the proposals if we do go down that route. Like, will we be able to see, will those two views be considered, or is it even before that we will say, no, that closing, whether it be one or two schools, whatever it is off the table? Like, where does that decision come into play or get considered as far as then when we're actually evaluating what the school committee will vote on? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and thank you for being part of the.
I might be oversimplifying.
No. And thank you for being part of the advisory committee. They could present several options, and at the advisory committee, it could come to the full school committee, and we could essentially vote down all of them and create one by ourselves. You can't, I know, there's so many different avenues that we could go down. It's so early. I mean, we could just make up so many different scenarios in our head right now.
And that's a good point too. Does it come down to, because I want to say when you did the original study, I thought it was, you had to get to a certain point of, was it middle schoolers being out into the high? There's a point where you can actually close schools without overburdening the schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, could it be just that right now we're going to shoot down all ideas, we do nothing, and then I'm throwing numbers out there, 3 years, then we're evaluating the buildings, right?
And it also said, hey, you should build a new middle school. So, I mean, there's just so much,
Right.
It's so early to tell. And it does ultimately come down to the school committee, as you know.
And if we do go down a route, and I've gotten this question from various people, what is the time for, say, hypothetically, we're looking to redistrict, that's still on the table today. There's no, it's gonna be for next year.
Dependent on the scenario.
Okay.
It's really, and I think we're trying to be, as you can imagine, we're trying to be cautious because an analysis, if we were to start jumping to, and I'm not suggesting any of you are asking us to do that, but it's not just the hot button, Mr. Conley, but it's also, it would be getting ahead of the process that needs to unfold.
open,
already-
public, transparent process
Yeah,
that
so-
we're trying to do, yeah.
Appreciate the question, but certainly we're not
So
prepared
even
to
that
answer.
has, okay.
No.
Just making sure, okay.
I
'Cause
think
know
I've
a lot
even
of
had
have
people-
asked that, like, if
yeah.
we're talking for next year, like, how soon is this happening? Just, we don't know.
Just to chime in too on some of this, because I didn't know about the previous report. So as someone from the outside, I think I feel like I would want it. Like, we paid for that, right? Like, we paid probably good money to have like very intelligent people put it together. So I think however it is used, probably, and I don't know how this works, I feel like it needs to be considered, and if it gets discarded, it just needs to be kind of like documented, because I think like people from the outside would be like, why'd you like, all right, so you're gonna pay money this time, are you gonna ignore them in 3 years when you hire somebody else? So I think just from an outsider perspective, I think kind of that documentation or communication throughout the process would be helpful.
Of course.
Mr. Allen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I just, because I manage the facilities department, I guess I would be curious as to why wouldn't we use the Castle Booze study? In Castle Booze's case, they've worked with the town for decades. Not trying to put you on a hot spot. And I also do respect, I'm in charge of a lot of processes, a lot of studies. Redistricting is definitely in the top 10 of one of the things that, is one of the most least desirable things a school committee member approaches when they go on this committee. That's widespread, it's emotional. Closing schools is easily in the top 10 of issues that, the death of a firefighter or a police officer in line of duty. There's a list that town managers, superintendents would put up there. I think closing schools is one of the most vulnerable positions you can be in. If you read the Globe or newspaper, look at where Boston's at. They're in the exact same position, right? It's not a shock that number 1 and number 2 are the hold harmless communities in Massachusetts, is Boston and Massachusetts. And Mayor Wu has to deal with exactly the same issues. And Superintendent Skipper have to deal with exactly the same issues that we're dealing with here. It's very vulnerable. It's a loss of a huge asset and a huge thing for a community. But I guess I'd be curious to hear, why wouldn't we use the Castle Booze study from 2 years ago? It was expensive. Thank you, Natalie. It can put you to sleep. Obviously not George. There's a lot of data in it. I know there's a refresh, but why wouldn't we use it?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, good.
No, I don't want to say the school committee is going to do X, Y, Z, because I don't want to speak for,
Sure.
for the committee. I don't want to say what we're going to do in April, because it hasn't come up. I'm uncomfortable saying
I
yes
understand.
to anything.
That report's
I
not
think
disregarded.
Sydney's just
Yeah,
questions, no more questions, right? She's not gonna say anything. But in all earnest, I think I would just make the plea that, Mike D'Angelo has been with the town for 25 years. He's built virtually every single structure in this town, with the exception of the police station. Every other facility, including every school, has had the Mike D'Angelo part for 25 years. And I think that not only Mike's expertise, and I know he's on the committee and appreciate his appointment to that, but using those previous studies, I would just encourage the school committee and the subcommittee, I forget the name of them, the facilities use subcommittee, I think it is, to really dig into that and take a look at that. And at a minimum, just to compare and contrast, even if you didn't use some of the data, what in 2 years changed, right? And I think Lucas just brought up a minute ago, space needs of what a student needs today might be a little different than a couple years ago versus the future, right? The next 10 years.
I'm glad you brought it up, and I just would say, for the record, just so that we're clear, we're not saying that that's not being a part of the conversation or the study or the AppGeo having that information. That's certainly not withheld, and that's one piece. The other thing I would say is that study, there are some pieces to it that I think would be important for us all to know. We have specialized programs that exist in our buildings. Those are in-district programs. That's not accounted for as part of that. So there's, your point, Jamie, around a refresh and making sure that we have very accurate information of how we're utilizing each building. And I think I would step it back again for everyone and say, we have to look at our teachable spaces as part of the whole big picture and do a full analysis. So I just would want to point that out as how we look at space and how it's being utilized for all the kids' needs that we have. So,
and I think, through Mr. Chairman, to Nicole's point earlier, part of that same part that Lucas just spoke to is about where are the investments in the future? Holding on, and you're seeing this in Boston, right? holding on to the neighborhood fabric, in a sense, is almost prohibiting them from investing in other areas, which is putting districts at a competitive disadvantage. We know arts and culture and foreign language are a competitive disadvantage for this district versus where other students go. And so by holding on to a footprint that electricity costs, you know, things that we're mentioning, right? Like in terms of the classroom size ratio. George, I'm sorry, the 40 students per classroom of your generation is not going to be the standard anymore.
Well, you don't
but,
have a sister and a Catherine teaching.
Right. But, you know, but also, like, are those dollars being invested in the right place? Because a lot of people can get, and you're seeing this again in Boston, if you read a lot of it, it's fascinating stuff, and it's very sad for somebody who worked in Boston, like myself, for a while. You know, there is that loss that people really feel. But on the same end, they're missing opportunity. When they say they're underfunding their schools in Boston, which they almost were in receivership, which, you know, might have been better for them, but that's a whole separate conversation. You know, they may be cutting off, you know, programmatic elements that students could be using for the future because we're holding on so dearly to something that of a time that didn't exist. And I think the chart that Miriam put up earlier of the student enrollment, I mean, really, this is a big factor. It's just simply the town grew for 30 years at a rate that was so unprecedented. And at the end of the day, there is never going to be, in our lifetimes, there is never going to be an enrollment back up at 6,500 students. It's just not going to happen. Birth rates, sociology, other things that go on in the world that we don't want to get into, it's just a reality. And so I think, you know, I hope that stuff is also part of the analysis about possibly some of the other opportunities lost about other investments in the educational system that students may need, including some of the cost drivers that we're talking tonight. We're very famous in Franklin and very proud, and I know everybody here believes this about our special education services. I mean, they're almost like the GOAT. They're legendary. People talk about it all the time. You know, are there other opportunities that are lost because we're just simply holding on to something we can't deal with? So I hope a lot of that gets baked into the analysis as one, and you know, as the school committee moves forward. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
And just on that point too, I think just to reiterate, that will be critical when we're thinking about community feedback, because I am a parent, I have a second grader and an incoming kindergartner, and for me, if you're telling me in 4th grade my child has to start a new school, I can probably swallow that a little bit easier if I know in 7th and 8th grade she's going to get an even better education. So I think, because I do think the community is going to react, right? You're of course expecting that, as they already are reacting. But I think to that point, making the linkage of, you know, yes, it's not going to be, we don't want that change, it's emotional, but what you'll gain over the long term, both financially, I think we focus on that a lot, right? And that's an integral part of it. What does it look like 10 years from now if we make this hard decision now? That's a critical link that I think we'll have to make with the community as we seek their feedback in that February, March timeframe. So.
And Nicole, just if I can, like you had just mentioned, you know, the community already is kind of glomming on. So that's just what I really wanted to kind of stress, is that I don't want anyone coming away tonight thinking that any decisions have been made at all regarding redistricting. This is all still very new. We're in step 1. You know, I'm a mom, my kid's way back there, listening hopefully to, you know, kid-friendly stuff back in the back. So I get it. I understand.
Process needs to unfold, right?
Yeah.
Out of respect for everybody involved and impacted.
Open, transparent process.
Just to put it in perspective, my brother-in-law used to sort eggs for Gerald Parmenter, so that's true. When Parmenter's farm was at where 495 is now, they raised Parmenter Reds. Not Parmenter, Rhode Island Reds. Rhode Island Reds. And my brother-in-law used to sort the eggs, so.
I learned something new.
It had nothing to do with anything.
Good storytelling.
All right, we're close to the end, right?
Yeah.
My grandfather's a chicken farmer in Bellingham. He used to buy those chickens to sell the eggs, so that was very fitting for Mr. Parmenter's
Look at that.
breed, so, okay.
Full circle.
Full circle.
Full circle.
This is want to give an overview of the process?
So just wrapping it up, these are just some proposed steps for the FY24 budget building process. School committee has already had their budget workshop. We had a budget presentation, well, tonight to the FinCom. That's where we are, December 7th.
You get to see us again in April.
Yep, we
May.
will. We will see you
Whichever.
again in April, May. And you can see the timeline where we are in between, working with our central office and building principals to put together budget, as well as with the town administrator and finance staff. Superintendent's recommended budget is expected to come out on March 14th. And we'll go
Okay,
from there.
yes said. I have some questions remaining. In reading all your stuff, I was very disappointed in the raises coming up at 4%, 4%, 4%. That were decided from the looks of it in the very last committee meeting, or was voted on the last committee meeting of the previous superintendent's tenure. It's every other bargaining unit in this town settled, or negotiated to 2.5 over the next 3 years. Teachers are at 4 over the next 3 years. That's that's a very significant difference in my mind, and a very significant financial difference in my mind. In effect, I did the arithmetic at home. Somebody making $75,000 working for the town, and I'm forgetting the numbers, but the teacher ends up with, because it's 4%, the second 4% is of last year's plus 4%, and the third one is plus the 4%. So it's not really 4%, it's, yeah, it compounds. It's like interest in a bank, if you can find one that pays it now. What was the justification to go at 4%? And I went back and looked. There was a couple of zeros. Miriam provided me with a list. Most of them added up to close to 2.5, 2.5, 2.5. But then bang, it's 4%. And that, plus I had questions about, one of them had plus 1% in the first quarter, and I guess I want to, what happened in the past is the past, but these are current. And it just makes his job difficult at the very least, negotiating with firemen and policemen and custodians and everybody who all settled at 2.5, and then suddenly, bang, 4. Would you like to address that?
Sure, if I could, through the chair. First, the Franklin School Committee has an obligation to negotiate with the union in good faith, which is what was done. Our negotiations are a collaborative process called interest-based bargaining, and we approach the process with a problem-solving versus positional orientation. Third, data supported this level of negotiated increase based on previous bargaining history, which you alluded to, including the deferral of a small percent increase and steps and lanes in the previous contract. The Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education reports the average teacher salary in the state is $80,000 a year.
How much, I'm sorry?
80,000?
We were at 78 at last year's budget negotiations. Last year's budget.
Yep. And I have of the 12 districts in the Hockomock League, so the averages are Sharon at 94,777, Foxborough at 91,495, Mansfield at 89,125, Attleboro 88,775, Canton at 88,417, Stoughton at 87,196, Milford at 84,923, Oliver Ames 83,580, North Attleboro 81,559, Franklin at 80,587, and finally King Philip at 79,104. So we need to retain our excellent teachers and our staff, and it is difficult to fill the vacancies that we outlined in an email with quality staff when they can go elsewhere and make more. We're having a hard time finding a physics teacher. We had someone interested, and then they gave up because they found somewhere else that would pay them more. And finally, the negotiated contract is a total package for which we added critical support for our students in some of the language. It was the right thing to do by educators and our students. We knew it would not be universally supported or popular. That being said, I'm disappointed in the narrative that is being set up, which doesn't need to be there. And now departments are pit against one another. The expectation that all employees get the same wage adjustment is contrary to the premise that each unit needs to be bargained with independently and in good faith. So I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
I just would add, in the state of our industry in education, it's certainly been a challenge across the state, across the country, to retain teachers. I think having competitive salaries we've been able to, I think, mitigate the influx we might have seen. And as Ms. Spencer mentioned, there was a package that was negotiated that included our advisory program, which we needed desperately to help all of our students get a common experience around all the things that can't be taught necessarily during the content of the day, but the idea around bullying, harassment, social emotional learning, all of the pieces that we want kids to be learning about and understanding to build in. The other thing is we've incorporated to having our department heads and directors part of the evaluation process. When you think about a high school, for example, having 125 staff, and you have 4 administrators to oversee the teaching and learning and responsibilities of all the staff, we've now been able to incorporate that into the contract. So understanding that, like as Ms. Spencer mentioned, not universally accepted, certainly in this day and age, and looking at where they were ranked locally, that was a decision that was made at that time.
I guess I read lots and lots of minutes, and I didn't see a lot of discussion about it. I think I'm torn. I somewhat agree with what you just said. I was there not so long ago trying to get people. I'm sure Jamie is there trying to hire. I mean, if you go out to try to hire, if Jim McLaughlin quits tomorrow, he's going to have a tough time matching what somebody's salary is. I understand all that, but it's like, oh well, we did it, and we did it on the last meeting of an outgoing superintendent. It just looks bad and looks half the problem. And again, that's a personal opinion, not this committee's opinion, I don't think. So there I am, and we can leave it at that, but it makes it tough. What is it? Did the 4% bring them to up above Oliver Ames or North Attleboro or wherever?
I think you brought us up. Some of those contracts are not yet settled in those other districts, so I don't know where specifically where all of them fall. But before we negotiated that contract, we were at the bottom, as Ms. Spencer identified for you.
Can somebody give me the Reader's Digest version? I mean, truly, it's 5 minutes a 9 of steps and lanes, because I mean, there's nobody else that does that, not in the municipal world. We've got, oh, you can go up these 3 steps, but then you can shift over to this lane and maybe go up another 2 steps. And what's the net result of a teacher enters, and I don't know what the names are. Step 1 goes to step 2, but now it's lane 4. Mm-hmm. What does that do?
It's a good question.
So the Reader's Digest version is steps go from 1 to 15 through the contract, and the lanes are based on your degree. Your bachelor's plus, we don't have bachelor's plus 15 anymore. We did, but we don't. Now it's bachelor's, master's plus 30, master's 45, master's 60 / doctorate. So you move down a step. As a teacher, the thought is that you generally start at your B1 straight out of school. We rarely hire at B1. And you move your way by getting a master's degree, which you're required to do within 5 years in the state of Massachusetts, and move down for every year of service, paid for 106 days, basically, per contract. But moving down the grid to doctorate step 15, basically. So from about, off the top of my head, I don't know, $48,000 to roughly 90-something, 100-something.
And that can happen.
Every
on-
year you teach under a license, you just keep moving down.
Right.
And then throughout your career, as you hit milestones in your degree, you move to the right. And at the same time, you're still working under that license, and that's how you move down. So the only way to shift across is to go to school, and you're required, as you said, in the first 5 years to get to master's at the least. And then that's how that system works, and it's across the board. So you brought that up, I think, Mr. Conley, around every school system in the state uses the same method. Their grids are different, and people pay attention to that as well. We've heard it. I've had people come and try to negotiate for higher. Well, this is our bachelor's step 3. This is where we're at. It's not negotiable in that regard. So, and sometimes we've had trouble securing people over time as you go through the interviews. But ultimately, you want to stay as competitive as possible. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just really quickly, I just want to say for the record that everything that Denise just said is completely accurate. There's no argument in the numbers. I completely trust and believe that those numbers are 100% accurate. We've long talked about the salary issues in Franklin. I've said this 100 ways from Sunday. Our tax levy for the town is not what other aspiring communities we want to be yet. And so therefore, the issue of the COLA, for those of you that don't know the acronym, cost of living adjustment, okay? And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because of what the question was on the steps and lanes. Every unit, if you're a bargaining unit, and we'll consider non-union kind of its own unit, right? Because as you just pointed out, there's a market base with a fire chief, a TA. The issue, just for my own self, being the town administrator, COLA equity to me is extraordinarily important because this is about culture. This is about getting the most out of people. It's about treating people with the most respect and fairness for what their role is on the team. 10 miles down the street, we hear about do your job all the time, right? If your job is to snap the football, do the best you can at that. The difficulty with culture is that you can't really have one department over here and another over there. It doesn't work well as a team. Custodians, trades, maintenance, firefighters, police officers, they can't do their job without us, and we can't do our job without them. So when you don't have COLA equity, regardless of the legal definitions of they have their contractual obligations in fair business, with the law, I have mine, we both have those situations. There's nobody disagreeing that there's a mandate anywhere that we have to have the same COLA. We've debated this for years. I'm not, and that's what Denise just mentioned. But I need people to understand at least my one view on this from one person's perch. COLA equity is about fairness to everyone. When one unit gets 2 and another gets 4, one unit gets 1 and another gets 2.5, the cost of living adjustment feels inequitable. So if you're a custodian cleaning up the building, you feel lesser than other people. Sorry, that's just the way they feel. When you're running into a burning building, you feel lesser than someone else, okay? We all know every unit, firefighters don't get steps and lanes, okay? Firefighters don't get summers off and all the other stereotypes that we have of each unit. Teachers don't get overtime, right? We all know teachers may not get an educational incentive on the same parity as a police officer, Quinn Bill. All, snow and ice removal, DPW employees get double time for certain hours in snow and ice removal. Why? Those are unique circumstances within each contract that respect the work and the incentive within that job. So as steps and lanes were just explained, That is all the financial incentive for a teacher to be able to get a master's degree, to get paid more, to move up to get promoted. It's no different than any other unit. It's just done in a different way because firefighters work 24-hour shifts, custodians work late after night, and DPW, we talked about snow plowing earlier, DPW employees are out there while we're at home, safe and sound, on remote learning, on Wi-Fi, complaining when the power is going to come back on so we can charge our phones an hour. There are real people out plowing roads in dangerous situations. Every unit and every employee has their role in this team. And that's just the way, as stubborn as it may sound, that's the way I do it. And I've been in this business long enough to see the fracture in culture, in communities, that make communities a lot less desirable to work for. They know it, I know it, and you know it. There are towns that people do not want to work for. You can Google it and you get it. This town is the inverse. Peter Padula, former Councilor Padula, was right. People completely emulate this town on almost everything we do. And when you have a team clicking and working as well as we do as a team, when those COLAs, cost of living adjustment, not raises, not the double time, not steps and lanes, not the other stuff there in the contracts, it does make people feel less important or more important. And I think everybody has to really understand that, that is a serious issue. So when Denise just mentioned a moment ago, again, in an accurate statement, that we're disappointed in the narrative around this, yeah, all of us are. We are all disappointed. And we're not disappointed because we don't believe that the maps and the rates don't show that our teachers are paid less. I guarantee you every one of our employees supports our teachers to be able to get paid the best that they get paid. We have a phenomenal team. Our firefighters, please go to them. It's a great, great place. But these things have typically long-term consequences on the issues of fairness and equity and how people feel that they're being treated. That was enhanced more so by the fact that the contracts just happened to come up at the end of a 2.5-year pandemic, where people are already feeling pretty jumpy about all this stuff and whatnot. So it's a very, very important thing that I've spoken to many in the school department about. I have the best job in Massachusetts. And, I can't speak for Lucas, but I can say that the superintendent job here is certainly one that I think a lot of people envy and appreciate as being probably one of the best jobs in Massachusetts, too. And we were both instilled with fortunate predecessors who started that culture that we are so lucky to have here in Franklin. When you have that culture, you actually save money in the long run, because you don't have units pitted against each other. One gets a 3, and then next year another unit's up, they get a 4, and then they come back 2 years later, and now they want 4. And the costs escalate to a point where the tax levy can't necessarily sustain all that. And so there's nothing that's going to prohibit them from going and doing their bargaining, just like inverse with me. But I do want the community to know, as well as the finance committee and everybody else listening at home on Zoom land, the COLA is not just it's a cost of living adjustment. It is about culture. It is about getting the most out of the team. And it really is a recruitment tool in and of itself. I can't tell you how many employees walk into my office, and I think the schools have the same situation, where they hear about the great community to work from in Franklin, the facilities, the equipment, all of the other camaraderie that we have, the great events that all of our teams do on their own. That is a part of it. And when you start to hear those negative narratives that Denise just pointed out, people have to be aware that those are serious cracks that could really actually end up having a long-term consequence down the road. So I appreciate you listening, Mr. Chairman. I just had to get that out based off what we heard from about the steps and lanes and Chair Spencer. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to let you know, I've been writing down a little list of things that you wanted to follow up on. So I put Reader's Digest of steps and lanes.
You can add this one to it.
Okay.
I hear about unfunded mandates all the time. I would like to see sometime a list of them and how much they cost. What is an unfunded mandate and what it costs? and that's obviously not a tonight discussion.
Oh,
What
I
is
was
it?
all ready.
I know,
Yeah.
she was ready.
Send it or something. You have my email.
Yes, I do.
The other thing, where is it? Oh. Is she the entire financial department?
No.
Well, who else?
No.
It seems like every meeting we go
I
to,
feel like
ask
it.
Mary. How, I mean,
Don't scare her
Mr.
away.
Sandini back there's got a harem out somewhere. Well, I think I'm getting bad vibes from him, but, that is a question. I just think there's enough crap going on between mandates and blah, 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 that ought to be looked at in your budget. And something just, what was it?
Yeah, there's 5 members of my team.
Yeah.
Thanks.
There are 5 other individuals that work for the school business administrator.
Okay, I just want to make sure. And anybody else have
And I'm
questions, and
grateful
I'll
for
think
that.
of what I was going to ask.
I'm grateful for
This is
that.
getting old stuff really stinks. Anybody?
No, I was gonna comment, Jamie commented on a couple of things that I was gonna say. And first of all, I wanna appreciate you guys letting us, ask questions as we went along, because I thought that was very valuable, so we didn't have to go back. But I think kind of getting an overall tenor, I think when we talk about the budget committee, when it comes to budget time, the school seems to come in with like, here's what we got. And we don't have much commentary on, hey, town funds are going up 3%, but we're asking for 5%. And I think that's where maybe some of the things, like even like you were talking about your justifications of your 4%. I don't know that we got that color when you came and presented, so I think those types of things where it just seems like it comes in a bubble with not considering the other elements around it, I think would be helpful in the future.
No, thank you. I'll write that down.
I thought of it. I went through the town's audit, looking for school committee stuff. There's nothing in there that I can find. The school, when you do a search, find on the page, I think the schools are mentioned 8 times.
In the town, the town audit?
Yeah, well, it's the town audit, but the last time I checked, you guys are the town.
No, I was just clarifying what audit you
Yeah,
referred to.
is there any, I'm a former banker, so I'm familiar with people looking over my shoulder. Who's looking over your shoulder? Does the school committee have, what's the name of the company? that-
Melanson Heath.
Yes,
Melanson Heath
Yeah. do
is our
they-
auditing firm.
yes.
Do they,
They audit
there's
our.
nothing on that audit is on the website. You can read it. It was
And we are
presented
part
to
of
the
that
council.
audit.
I couldn't find it.
We are included in that audit, and I'm sure Mr. Sandini would explain
So
that
it's,
as well.
it's somewhere I can sit down
There-
tomorrow,
There
not
is
tonight,
also an
and
end
read
of
it.
year report audit on financial reporting that I do, so that is audited as well.
Is it on the website?
It's
It-
not,
does it
there were
ought to
no
be?
findings, so it wasn't put on the website, in all honesty, for the end of year report.
A suggestion, it ought to be
so-
there. The town's
Happy to do
is.
that. The single audit also is part of the town-wide audit, and the single audit of federal programs, because a lot of the funding that we're getting is from federal funding. That's also included.
Okay, I had one other thing and I've lost it again. Anybody else? Terrell?
Just a couple, one observation that leads to maybe a more specific question, but it seems that, well, one, the growth of the budget really has to do with not teachers, right? And so I guess I'm curious what the cost difference is of support staff versus teachers. Because does a smaller classroom size with a good teacher enable you to provide better outcomes than adding a lot of different support staff? Or is that really just, you absolutely need these support staff that potentially are paid more than teachers? I don't know, right? Just trying to get a sense of how that's done and how that's thought through, because in some ways it feels like the community, you're taking on a lot more than was ever asked of schools in the past. And I totally understand that. And so I'm just trying to understand, at what point is it kind of like, well, that's not really what we're supposed to be doing, and maybe there's other community resources that should be used, not school budget and not school resources to justify, right? Because you coming before us and justifying all of this additional support staff, to me, like that's interesting and really tough, and that's where it gets very opaque for me.
So I think having class sizes in a desirable range. Right now, we have some guidelines that we try to follow, 18 to 22 for our K to 2, and then 3 to 12, you look at higher than that. So you're looking at 22 to 26, 26-ish. So when we try to look at, that's like, I think, what we've established in this town as being those pieces. So I think that is one factor. There's also the other factor is, how are we supporting the environment? I talked a little bit about that earlier. But ultimately, what this really comes down to as well is every year when we talk about the process we go through to evaluate what's working, what's not, how are we looking at like an academic return on investment, if you will, right? How are we seeing what we're doing? Is it working? And I think we talked a little bit about data that we're using to try to do that. But there's just two other points I would make. Your point around connecting to other resources is something we share an interest in with the town. We don't want to be, we are the hub for a lot of things, and we want to care for children and educate them wholeheartedly and in a well-rounded way. We can't just teach math, because kids come in with a host of needs, and we can't just say we can ignore those and just do math. And I mentioned this at one of the school committee meetings, like if we worked for a factory and we were producing something, we could say, you know what, we're not having that many people buying things, so let's cut down on shifts. Let's tell folks, let's just produce what we need to make the case. We have kids coming every day with a variety of needs that there's an expectation, morally and legally, that we meet the needs of every kid that's in the room. So we try to look at every aspect of that when we design and put a budget forward that supports those needs. You bring up a really good point. And the needs have changed, and we are trying to fill and support the kids in our buildings, but these are all part of those discussions. So a social worker, for example, is someone who's directly connecting families with outside resources, because our partnerships with resources. But someone has to do that work to make that happen as well. So.
Yeah, it's just difficult when I hear 30% now, right? Our higher need, and you know, that wasn't the case 20 years ago. So I don't know if it's that we're assessing needs much different than we were in the past. And so I guess I have a kid that, right? I've got several kids that are in school with you guys, and I really appreciate it. And I think that they're very well educated, and so. But they don't ever talk about support staff, right? So it's not something we ever hear about, and it may just be that they happen to not need it. But that's where I just try and understand that figure, because I think that when I look at higher education in general, that is, you're not alone. Like, this is across the board, across universities, very much so. And I just think if I were a teacher and I could do more or fewer students or something, and I agree, the class size seems okay. So that's where I don't understand where the disconnect is, that there needs to be so much additional support staff.
I think maybe we could add a little bit more.
Or even to go on that, you have all this additional support staff, but how much are we spending on, for example, each of the different categories you're talking about? And is dollar amount, human capital wise, whatever, is it enough? Is it not enough? Is there a different way to approach it than just, you know, if all the students are scattered in different schools, can we bring them together for certain reasons? Who knows?
And in one conversation we had, we talked about doing really well and being in the bottom quarter of the state, and then and I say this as like to round off the conversation. In another aspect, we're in the bottom quartile, but we still want to look at how are we leveraging our resources and using what we have. So I would just say that we're not someone who's sitting as the district who is at that top spending bracket. That's trying to justify the purchases we're making with the extra money we have, but we are trying to utilize. But I will promise you this. We take this seriously, and we want to be fiscally responsible, but also making sure we are meeting the needs of every kid that we have. And I think there's an expectation in this town that we do that, and we do that well. I also think that I'm also a taxpayer, property owner in town, and my own kids are in the school. I'm invested in our success and our town's success. I appreciate what Mr. Helen mentioned about the services all of our other departments offer and what we benefit from is living here. So we want to be as fiscally responsible as possible, but ultimately we have an obligation to make sure that we're putting forth the best program, because I do think that impacts my house value when my schools are good.
Oh, yeah.
And when you don't have that, this is a complex system, and we're a piece of it. Those are
It just
leverage
seems
points.
that information is rather opaque.
Yeah,
Be interesting to see what it looks like.
yeah, understood.
I've apparently been ignoring Chuna on Zoom. Chuna, you have questions?
I did have one question, and thank you. No, you weren't ignoring me. I just kind of had a question about what was being discussed around like unfunded mandates and the high needs like students, because I know public schools are required to pay for a lot of services that I think high needs students or students with disabilities require. And I was just wondering if a data point could be shared, if the school has it, about like what is the cost of the high needs group category, not just like the numbers, but how much of the school budget goes towards those types of costs. 'Cause I know the per pupil cost is just an average, but it doesn't break it out for like those specific categories.
So I can't tell you specifically how much all of our high needs population costs. What I will do is give you one example of a student who might be in an out-of-district placement that could.
Just, I'm not hearing you, so
Um,
talk in the microphone.
Sure.
There you go.
Hopefully I won't hear,
No
you won't
echo
hear me
now,
twice again.
whatever.
I can give you an example of one of our students who might be in an out-of-district specialized placement. Could be a residential placement, it could be a private school placement, it could be anywhere from $40,000 to $250,000 on an annual basis for the cost to educate that student in a free, to provide a free appropriate public education for that student in the least restrictive environment per law. So we, I'm gonna say, educate about 75 students they access their curriculum through an out-of-district placement, which, as I said, could cost anywhere between $45,000 and $250,000, $300,000 a year.
I mean, at $250,000 a year at 75 students.
No, we're not, there are not 75 in a $350,000 placement, but there are a few. 250. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that doesn't include the cost for transportation.
Right.
We're not transporting in those types of residential placements, but we are transporting to private school placements, and the costs can be significant, and that is where some of our circuit breaker reimbursement comes from, as I mentioned earlier.
Some of the costs associated with our budget also incorporate students that we're able to educate in district that
That's
would
true.
otherwise go to an outside placement, but because we offer programming and hire specialized teachers to teach students in district, we provide our own in-district transportation. You saw me glance back to Mrs. Morano, is our assistant super student services, excuse me, it's late. We often look at what are the needs of the students and how can we best meet their needs. And if we can do that within our district, then that's what we do, and we create programs that allow for that.
And it's a far more cost-effective way to educate our students and keeps our students in our schools with their neighborhood population.
Chana, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. And just to also expand on that, are there other funding opportunities for things like this? I know that they're considered like unfunded mandates, but are there grants or anything for maybe towns or districts that have like a high number of high need students?
I'm not aware of grant funding. Well, we can use our federal grant money under 94-142 under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act. We can use that funding for out-of-district placements.
We currently use that funding for our support professionals, educational support professionals in our classrooms. But that is one option for the utilization of that funding.
Thank you.
Just a couple questions on.
She has the list.
Sorry. A lot have been checked off though, so I'll try to be brief. I know it's late for everyone. Not dwelling on the per pupil spend, but curious as to, as I hear about our per pupil spend being, call it at the bottom, somewhat quartile, right above that quartile, but however, we are considered one of the best school districts, so that's fantastic. But when we think about, how are we measuring that? Like, how are we comfortable with our per pupil spend? Are we looking at anything, any intangibles? Is it the mapping that we're doing now? Is it building out analytics, or have we been historically doing those types of analytics to say, well, we know we're doing something right? And it kind of goes along the lines of what I said, which is now probably a couple hours ago, but we seem to be using our money efficiently as far as the per pupil spend, because we do have a great school district and we are in the bottom quartile of spend. But how do we know that? Like, how do we measure that we don't need to increase that spend in certain areas? Does that make sense? Maybe we aren't looking at it and we're just, I don't know, trying to figure out how we're comfortable with that per pupil spend dollar value. Or are you comfortable?
Some
Yeah.
of us may not be.
Yeah.
Right.
I think when we design our budget, we try to look at what are our goals and what are we trying to achieve, and then how do we build out programs and supports and what we need. And it's not just creating more staff or adding more people, but it's a combination of things. So I mentioned the map testing as an example, but that's an example of trying to get information on kids and good data on kids. We also have a system that pulls in it pulls in MCAS scores, and it's called Panorama. So we're trying to build the systems. You know, we've had some of these pieces in place for a long time. I think Franklin has a great reputation for education. I think we could continue to improve. And I think when we design budgets throughout the year and present them to school committee for approval and go through, we try to look at where are our needs. You know, is writing a need at the middle school that we need to focus on? So we have to think about it. How are we designing our professional development? Do we have a curriculum coach in there who can work with teachers directly? Like, those are costs that are associated with a tangible goal and area of growth that we want to move. We've been pretty clear, I think, as a community and as a school committee. MCAS is not the end-all be-all to how you rank a school system. There's so much more to it. Even if we do decent, even if we do above the state average, it's not something, I would say that even if we didn't, you know, but we've been fortunate to retain some really strong teachers and have some pieces in place that allow us to do well by kids. But I think we could continue to add more support. And I think about, you mentioned, like a librarian, for example, really media literacy, and we think of the world kids are going to be entering as they move on, and trying to make sure that they have the resources they need to find information and use information and communicate it effectively. Teachers are teaching that, but there's also other people who are involved with more specialized. I often hear about financial literacy. I think about what I didn't learn in high school and what would have benefited me before I joined the Marines and was down at Camp Lejeune spending money I probably shouldn't have been spending. But I would tell you that if I had understood compound interest, just that concept, I think I would have been better off on both ends, investing and borrowing. So those ideas, but these types of things, and you have to think about where does it fit in a schedule, who's teaching it, how does it look. So these are things that we would aim to try. That's how I envision our system, really helping support kids so that when they get that diploma, we've rounded that off. If we're in a situation where we're not spending, you know, what it costs to put some of those pieces in place, then we say that's going to come off the table for now. And sometimes, as you know, when you develop your own budget, whether you're at a job or a company and you're involved with that, or your own home budget, you have to look at how do you maximize what you have to get the most out of it. So that's how I would just frame that for you.
Okay, so yeah, it's almost fair to say we don't even really, well, I'm not saying you don't look at it, but we don't dwell on the per pupil spend. It's really driven by, are we meeting the goals that we set as the school district? And we're not saying, oh, we're spending less, we need to be spending more. It's, are we meeting our goals? Where do we have gaps? Where can we, is that fair
I think if we
assessment?
were able to support more, the per pupil would go up, right?
Yes,
But
yeah.
I don't think we say, we're not picking a per pupil number,
Yeah.
because I don't think that's how we've developed the budget.
I think it's just one
sense.
more data
Right.
point in our
In the whole
story.
picture.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. And then do we look at, and maybe I'm dwelling on, now I am dwelling on it per pupil. Do we look at that across, and I'm saying this also from the mindset of the redistricting, because a lot of that has come up is the equitable disbursement of money amongst the schools. Are we looking at the demographics amongst, I'll call it elementary, because that of course is part of the bigger topic, but are we looking at is, you know, I'll say Kennedy getting less money than Keller? I say less money, I know schools are gonna get more or less money, but do we look at it at a per pupil? What is, you know, if we have, call it 10% of the kids at Keller need special services, their per pupil is this. Like, do we get into that granular of analytics to make sure that all that funding is equitable? And I guess, can we at some point in the future maybe get a summary of that to look at? Just
Yeah, so the number of positions that are budgeted at each school by category are included in the budget.
Yeah.
And I can certainly have a conversation with you about that offline at this point. But yes, we meet with principals to talk about what their needs are for their student population. So, you know, you mentioned Keller, who might have a specialized program there, so we're going to provide some additional staff to support that specialized program. It's not likely to have 25 students in that classroom, so there might be 2 teachers in there with 10 students. There might be a teacher and an ESP in there. So yes, we're absolutely looking at that. In terms of the I'll call it just the building-based budget, we give the principals an allotment to purchase materials and supplies for their building, you know, books and pay for the things that they need in their building based on a per pupil count. So yes, it does vary based on the school and the nuances.
The number of kids, the number of
Right.
students
Yep.
in different categories.
And then, sorry, just one, on staffing, how many positions do we have open? Have they been open for a long time? And then is there a point in time where a position has been open long enough that we would decide, all right, we don't need it because it's been open for so long? Just curious of how that looks
So-
in a world where it is very difficult to recruit
Right.
and retain talent.
You may have heard, like, I think physics was mentioned earlier today. So what we've done is we've had to, in certain situations where we can't fill, we've had to have teachers who are teaching a full load, they each get a prep every day. You get a prep period to prepare. We have to have them teach an additional class, and it's voluntary, but they'll do it as part of the process. And then what we have to do is compensate them for not taking having a preparatory period during that day, because they're now in the physics class. So each period, the students get the same teacher who's licensed as a Franklin teacher. In addition, we've added a virtual high school program. It's basically an online program that teaches the physics concepts, assess students and whatnot. So that's one example. In an English class, we have the same thing where we have a teacher going in and teaching, just teaching the courses that teacher would have taught. So
And so
those
they
are
are
the two.
getting compensated for that extra.
They have to
They
be.
are getting,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah.
That's kind of my follow-up question is where does, in our budget, when we have those vacancies, where do those funds go? But they are being allocated in scenarios where we do have teachers covering.
So if a teacher's covering, other times it's a long-term sub. You may know if someone's on a maternity leave, we would pay a long-term substitute to cover the course for their time out. That's another example I would use.
I think I'm good, thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else? One more question. How many civics teachers do we have? Another
History
hot
teachers.
button with me is when you see somebody do an interview on the street and they stick a microphone to their thing and they don't know anything about how government works, and it's been, and that's a next time question. Okay?
I'm gonna write that one down too.
Yeah,
I
that
think if you're saying civics, I'm trying to make sure I don't combine
You know,
social studies.
how
It's your
does,
civics
how does
teachers,
the
yeah.
Congress work? How does the State House work? How does the town work?
I was just in an observation where they showed the Jimmy Kimmel
Yeah.
to the kids. That was the hook the teacher used, and then he went into
Well,
the
it's-
lesson was around
You
some
know, I
of those pieces.
consider that why you have to
Just bring
fight with
Schoolhouse
people
Rock
to
back.
vote.
Yeah.
Okay, we beat that one to death. All right,
I did add that.
Some final comments.
Um,
This is I've been on this committee, I think since, I think it's 10 years now, or thereabouts. This is the best presentation from a school committee we have ever had. Responsive, didn't like all the questions, the 4% question clearly hit a hot button, but that's fine, that's what we get to do. We're the only watchdog committee in the town. Frankly, the council doesn't ask a lot of questions when it comes to budget. They just don't. They don't have, that's not their purview. Well, it's their purview, but it's not their mindset, if you will. This one does. As you can tell, there were some pretty heavy questions here. People were prepared, and I appreciate it to the committee. But that was as good a presentation as we've had from any school committee in 10 years. We thank you.
Thank you for inviting us. I think this was an opportunity for us to share, and I think those questions, as hard as they are questions people have within the community as well. So we appreciate the time you took to prepare
Actually,
questions.
I think this is the most people we've had on Zoom since this has been going on. Who knows how many are watching on YouTube, which it also is, or Channel 29 or whatever, 12 or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I may, Mr. Chairman, just offer a few comments in closing, just a few brief remarks. Thank you very much for your kind words, and thank you all for taking the time, I know it's late, taking the time to speak with us this evening and for your questions. And just in closing, just to frame this, and really the purpose behind all the numbers, all the data that we talked about tonight, is ultimately the education of our students here in Franklin and the quality of that education that we're providing all of our students. We spoke a number of times of the different higher need students that we're having in our district, how we may have fewer students but higher needs in a variety of different areas, whether it be students with special needs, low-income students, English language learning students, and as you mentioned, the services we're providing for those students. Now, they deserve the best possible education just the same as any other student in the town of Franklin, and we have the obligation to give them that education. But it's not just those students that are benefiting from these new services that we're providing. It's all of our students, the interventionists, curriculum specialists, counselors. Now, all of those positions, they provide a higher quality education for every single student which really improves everyone's chances of being more successful past Franklin Public Schools. I'm a proud Franklin High graduate, class of 2009, and I'm very happy to see that we are offering services now to our current generation of students that I wasn't receiving when I was back at Franklin High. And not only that, but when we offer these specialized services for our higher needs students, that allows for them to get the care and education that they need that doesn't take away a teacher from the other student population, that doesn't reroute other resources, and allows for the entire student population to get the education that they need as well. And when we take a step back, all these pieces come together to provide everyone the educational experience that all our students need and deserve. And when that happens, our community does become a more desirable place for all of us to live and be in, and that people notice that, people move here, that brings in more revenue and all sorts of other resources to our town. So ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what's behind these numbers, is the better quality of education that we're providing our students here, the better quality of life that we're providing for all of our residents. So thank you very much for having us this evening, and we really appreciate you taking the time.
We shall meet again.
Yes.
Thank you.
We have 2 agenda items left. Future agenda items? Who else would we like to persecute?
So, through Mr. Chairman, so it's not 100% guaranteed, but the January meeting will likely be, I hope, the capital plan, some additional ARPA funds, and and the compensation and classification study results. The consultant is available that night to come in and, well, she'll be Zooming in from another state, but she'll be here over Zoom to walk through the compensation and classification study that was just about complete. So that's probably a full meeting. February, I'll ask for the permitting departments, Board of Health, Planning, Conservation, and our building commissioner, passports, all that stuff. And then March, you're probably gonna have a joint budget subcommittee meeting at some point. And then also, we're gonna have to have Brutus come in to talk about stormwater credits. So it's not just about charging people fees, but how do you reduce your fees? So that's looking like the next 3 months. It may be kind of shelled around a little bit, but after that, you're in the budget season. And it depends on who else you might want to have come in, but that's generally what we scripted out based on the feedback already.
Okay, so they're set for a while.
I think they're pretty good.
Yeah.
I think pretty good.
Now, how do you want to do, you have an executive session?
Yep. So you have to make somebody has to make a motion, it's written right here, to enter executive session to consider the purchase, exchange, et cetera, and then somebody has to second that, and then Alicia will help us with Zoom, and then everybody has to leave, so we can talk about private property.
Okay, I make a motion to have an executive session to consider the purchase, exchange, lease, or value of real property.
Second.
Roll call.
George?
Yes.
Natalie?
Yes.
Stephanie?
Yes.
Tyrell?
Yes.
Chana?
Yes.
Michael?
Yes.
And Nicole is yes.
Okay, we'll go to a short recess while the room clears up.
And Chana, stay on Zoom.
Yes, stay with us, Chana.